My parents looked me straight in the eye and told me that family helps family. I almost laughed, because the last time they used that sentence, I was 16 years old, paying rent for my own bedroom while my little brother lived there for free. My name is Chloe Turner. I'm 27 years old, and the people standing on my front porch asking to move into my house were the same people who taught me, before I was even old enough to vote, that love came with a monthly bill. Before I tell you what happened, let me ask you something. If your parents made you grow up before you were ready, then disappeared the moment you needed them, would you ever owe them anything? If stories about justice finally catching up with people are your thing, make sure you're subscribed. You're going to want to hear how this one ends. People always imagine neglect as something loud. They picture screaming matches, broken furniture, police cars outside the house. That wasn't my childhood. Mine was quiet, painfully quiet. It lived in the little things. It lived in who got the bigger bedroom, who got the newest clothes, whose birthday cake came from the bakery instead of the grocery store. It lived in the way my mother smiled without thinking whenever she looked at my brother, and how her face became strangely tired whenever she looked at me. His name was Ethan. He was 3 years younger than me. If you asked my parents, he'd tell you I was exaggerating, that they loved us equally, that life had simply been different. But memories don't lie. When I was 12, Ethan wanted the bedroom overlooking the backyard because it had better sunlight for the fish tank Dad bought him. That room had been mine since kindergarten. One Saturday morning, Dad walked in carrying empty cardboard boxes. "Pack your things." I looked up from my homework. "Why?" "We're switching rooms." I blinked. "But why?" "Ethan likes yours better." I laughed because I genuinely thought he was joking. He wasn't. "But all my stuff." "You'll fit in the smaller room." That was it. No discussion. No compromise. By dinner, Ethan was showing off his new room, while I sat in what had once been the guest room, trying to convince myself the cracked window wasn't letting in cold air. Mom didn't even notice I cried that night. Or maybe she did. She just didn't think it mattered. Looking back, that's what hurt the most. Not that they chose him. That choosing him became so normal they stopped realizing they were doing it. By the time I turned 14, I had learned an important survival skill. Don't ask. If Ethan got something, don't ask why you didn't. If family vacation plans revolved around his baseball tournaments, don't ask why your school recital wasn't important. If your parents forgot your birthday until dinner, smile. Say thank you. Pretend it doesn't hurt. Because asking questions only made you dramatic. I became excellent at disappearing. Teachers loved me. I made straight A's. I kept my room spotless. I babysat neighborhood kids for extra money. Not because I wanted spending cash, because I hated asking my parents for anything. Asking meant giving them another chance to sigh dramatically. You always need something? Funny. Ethan always needed something too. The difference was that when he asked, Dad smiled. When I asked, Dad checked his wallet first. By 16, I'd saved almost $2,000. Every birthday, every babysitting job, every Christmas card with $20 inside from relatives who actually remembered I existed. I kept the money hidden inside an old dictionary underneath my bed. That money meant freedom, college, maybe my own apartment someday. Maybe proof that life wasn't always going to feel like walking on broken glass. Then, one Friday evening in October, Dad asked me to sit at the kitchen table. Mom was already there. She wasn't looking at me. She was stirring tea, she wasn't drinking. That should have been my first warning. Dad folded his hands. "So," I waited. "You're 16 now." "Yeah." "We think it's time you started contributing." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned back. "You have a job." I worked 12 hours a week at a local grocery store stocking shelves after school. Minimum wage. Mostly weekends. I know. So starting next month, he slid a piece of notebook paper across the table. $350. I stared at it. What is this? Rent. I honestly thought I had misheard him. Rent? Dad nodded like he was explaining basic math. You live here. I looked at Mom. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I'm 16. And? I can't even sign a lease. You don't need to. He smiled. This is about responsibility. Responsibility? Funny word. I swallowed. What happens if I don't pay? The silence answered before Dad did. You'll need to find somewhere else to live. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain refused to believe my own father had just threatened to kick out his 16-year-old daughter. You can't be serious. Oh, I am. Mom finally spoke. We're preparing you for adulthood. I looked between them, then toward the hallway where Ethan's laughter drifted from the living room as he played video games. Is Ethan paying rent? Dad almost looked offended. Of course not. Why? He's 13. So, when I was 13, Dad interrupted. You aren't him. The room became impossibly quiet. There it was. 4 words. The truest thing he'd ever said. You aren't him. No, I wasn't. I wasn't their favorite. I wasn't their priority. I wasn't even their responsibility anymore. I was a bill they expected to pay itself. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. $350, half my monthly paycheck. Gone. My college savings? Gone too. Because groceries, gas, school supplies, phone bill. Those suddenly became my responsibility as well. Within 3 months, nearly every dollar I earned disappeared back into the house I was supposedly lucky to live in. Meanwhile, Ethan got a new gaming console for Christmas. Dad called it a reward for working hard in school. I'd made honor roll. Again, my reward was being allowed to keep living in my own bedroom. Sometimes I'd hear my parents laughing downstairs while I calculated whether I could afford shampoo that week. I started skipping lunch at school. $10 saved each week. It mattered. A teacher noticed. Chloe, aren't you eating? I'm just not hungry. Lie. Every day. Eventually, hunger stopped feeling unusual. It became background noise, like the refrigerator humming, like the clock ticking, like disappointment. One afternoon, my manager, Mrs. Alvarez, asked why I kept volunteering for extra shifts. You know you're still in school, right? I smiled. I like staying busy. She studied me for a long moment. You look exhausted. I've just been studying. Another lie. The truth sounded ridiculous. My parents were charging me rent. Who would believe that? Adults always assume parents know best. If a teenager complains, she's probably exaggerating, so I stayed quiet. The rent increased when I turned 17. $450. Inflation, Dad said. I almost admired the confidence. He said it while eating steak I'd unknowingly helped pay for. My savings account slowly bled dry. Every deposit vanished. College brochures piled up in my backpack because applying felt pointless. How was I supposed to save for tuition when my own parents treated me like a tenant? The worst part wasn't the money. It was dinner. Every single night. Dad would ask Ethan about baseball practice. Mom would ask Ethan about friends. They'd laugh, make weekend plans, talk about his future. Then someone would remember I was sitting there. Oh, Mom would glance over. Did you pay your rent? Not, how was school? Not, how was work? Not, are you okay? Just, did you pay? I became a monthly transaction. Nothing more. One Saturday, I came home after an 8-hour shift to find strangers walking through the house. A realtor. My parents were showing them around. I stood in the hallway, still wearing my grocery store uniform. Dad spotted me. Oh, Chloe. I waited. We're thinking about renovating. The realtor smiled politely. Then she asked the question that froze me. So this is the room you rent? Rent. She said it so casually, as though I were some college student sharing a house. Dad nodded proudly. She's learning financial responsibility. The realtor looked impressed. Oh, that's wonderful parenting. I don't remember walking upstairs. I only remember sitting on my bed, still wearing my name tag, still holding my backpack, realizing that my parents weren't embarrassed. They were proud. Proud that they had convinced the world they were teaching responsibility instead of abandoning their own daughter while she was still legally a child. That night, for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to imagine leaving. Not for college, not after graduation, just leaving. I didn't know where I'd go. I didn't know how I'd survive. But somewhere deep inside me, something had finally broken. And once something breaks completely, it never fits back together the same way. I just didn't know that 3 weeks later my father would say 8 words that would change the rest of my life forever. You have 30 days to figure it out. I remember every detail of that moment. Not because I wanted to, because trauma has a strange way of preserving the worst days of your life in perfect definition. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast. The old clock above the refrigerator clicked louder than usual. Rain tapped against the window in slow, uneven rhythms. I had just come home from school. My backpack was still hanging off one shoulder when Dad folded the local newspaper, set it on the table, and said those 8 words. You have 30 days to figure it out. I stared at him. Figure what out? He looked almost annoyed that I had asked. You've been late on rent twice. I paid. 3 days late. I had to wait until payday. You still paid late. I looked toward my mother. She was wiping down a perfectly clean countertop. Not once did she look up. Dad, I had a chemistry lab fee. You should have budgeted better. I literally had to choose between paying school fees and paying you. He shrugged. That's adulthood. No. The word escaped before I could stop it. His eyebrows lifted. What did you say? I said no. I had never spoken back before. Not like that. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it inside my ears. This isn't adulthood. Dad slowly stood. What is it then? This is making your kid pay to exist. His jaw tightened. You think you've got it hard? I know I do. You have food. Barely. You have a roof. I pay for it. You have electricity. I help pay for that too. He stepped closer. So you're saying we're bad parents? The trap. Every conversation ended there. If I answered yes, I was disrespectful. If I answered no, everything they had done became acceptable. I swallowed. I'm saying I'm tired. Mom finally spoke. We're tired too. I laughed. Not loudly, just enough to surprise myself. Tired from what? She looked offended. Excuse me? What exactly are you tired from? She opened her mouth. Closed it again. Dad answered instead. We're done with this conversation. No. I heard my own voice shaking. You don't get to end it. His eyes narrowed. I've paid you thousands of dollars. Silence. I've missed school trips. Silence. I skip lunch. Silence. I work almost every day after school. Silence. I haven't bought new shoes in over a year because you said rent comes first. I looked down. The front of my sneakers had started separating from the sole. I'd glued them twice already. Dad followed my gaze. You still have shoes. Something inside me simply stopped. No shouting, no crying, no dramatic explosion. Just nothing. When people talk about having their heart broken, they imagine a sharp pain. Mine felt like numbness, as though every feeling inside me quietly packed its bags and walked away. Dad picked up the newspaper again. If you don't like our rules, he didn't even look at me. You have 30 days. Then he turned the page. Conversation over. I walked upstairs, closed my bedroom door, locked it, sat on the floor, and stayed there until it got dark. I cried quietly, not because I was afraid, because I realized something I'd spent years refusing to admit. They meant it. They genuinely believed they were right. That was somehow worse. If they'd hated me, I could understand hatred. If they'd been cruel on purpose, at least cruelty made sense. But they honestly believed they were preparing me for life. That charging their teenage daughter rent while supporting their son completely was good parenting. How do you argue with people who have rewritten reality? You don't. You leave. The next morning, I started making plans. Tiny ones. I asked Mrs. Alvarez if there were more hours available. She looked surprised. You're already working almost every shift I can legally give you. I can do weekends. You already do. I'll work mornings. Before school? If you need me. She studied me. Sit. I froze. Sit down, Chloe. We sat in the break room. She handed me a bottle of water. You've been working here almost 2 years. I nodded. I've watched you come in sick. Another nod. You never complain. Silence. You've never once called out. I stared at the floor. She leaned forward. Tell me what's going on. I almost lied. The words reached my mouth. Then something happened that I still think about years later. She waited. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush me. She didn't fill the silence. She just waited. And after years of nobody actually wanting the truth, it spilled out. Everything. The rent, the threats, skipping meals, losing my savings, trying to stay in school, trying to survive. By the end, I was crying so hard I could barely breathe. Mrs. Alvarez didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then she quietly asked, You're 16? I nodded. And your parents charge you nearly $500 every month? Another nod. She rubbed her forehead. Oh, sweetheart. No one had called me that in years, not with kindness. She looked angry, not at me, at them. Do you have somewhere safe to go? No. Grandparents? They passed away. Aunts? Uncles? They live out of state. She nodded slowly. Then she said something that would stay with me forever. Adults don't always deserve the title. I looked up. What? Being older doesn't automatically make someone right. Nobody had ever told me that before. My entire life had been built around the opposite idea. Parents know best. Adults are right. Respect your elders. Mrs. Alvarez reached across the table. You are not failing adulthood. She squeezed my hand. The adults in your life are failing you. I cried harder. The next few weeks became a blur. School, work, homework. Searching online for rooms I couldn't afford. Cheap apartments that required proof of income, security deposits, references. Everything seemed impossible. Every listing reminded me of the same thing. I wasn't supposed to be doing this. Most 16-year-olds worried about driver's licenses, prom, math tests. I was calculating whether sleeping in my car was legal. Except, I didn't even own a car. The countdown became real. 23 days, 21, 19. Dad actually marked rent due dates on the kitchen calendar, as though reminding me helped. As though I could magically create money. One evening, Ethan wandered into my room. He was carrying a new baseball glove. Real leather. Expensive. He tossed a ball into the air. You leaving? I looked up. I guess. He shrugged. Can I have your TV? I stared at him. My TV? You won't need it. I wanted to be angry. Instead, I felt sad. He wasn't evil. He'd simply grown up in the same house under completely different rules. Nobody had ever taught him to think about anyone except himself. Dad said I might get your room. Of course. He looked around. I like the window. The same window I'd lost years earlier. The same pattern. Take from Chloe. Give to Ethan. Repeat. I smiled. Not because I was happy, because suddenly everything made perfect sense. It had never been about money. It had always been about value. They believed he deserved more. They believed I deserved less. Money was simply the language they used to express it. 17 days left. Mrs. Alvarez pulled me aside after closing. I made some calls. What? My cousin owns a duplex. I blinked. He's looking for someone to watch the property. What do you mean? Small apartment over the garage. I couldn't breathe. It's tiny. I didn't care. You'd help with basic maintenance? I almost started crying again. The rent would be, she hesitated, $200. Half of what my parents charged. I laughed. Actually laughed. You mean, you'd have your own place? My own place. 2 words I'd barely allowed myself to imagine. But I'm 17. We'll work through the paperwork. I covered my mouth. You've earned a chance. No, I hadn't earned it. I'd survived long enough for someone decent to notice. Sometimes that's enough. When I told my parents I had found somewhere to live, I expected them to be relieved. Maybe even proud. Instead, Dad frowned. So you're really leaving? You told me to. I expected you to apologize. I actually looked behind me to see if he was talking to someone else. Apologize? For your attitude. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You threatened to throw me out. You forced our hand. By paying you late? You were disrespectful. Mom crossed her arms. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion. Blown out of proportion. I looked around the kitchen, at the table where I'd signed over hundreds of paychecks, at the cabinets I'd helped fill, at the house I'd paid to stay inside. And I realized, if I stayed one more minute, I'd start believing them again. So I simply said, my moving truck comes Saturday. Then I walked away. Behind me, I heard Dad mutter, she'll be back. Mom answered quietly, reality will teach her. I didn't turn around, but I remember smiling. Not because they were wrong, because for the first time in years, reality was finally going to be mine instead of theirs. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold. Everything I owned fit into the back of a borrowed pickup truck. A mattress, 3 boxes of clothes, books, a microwave Mrs. Alvarez had found at a yard sale, my little television, a lamp. That was it. 17 years of life, reduced to a handful of boxes. As I carried the last one outside, I paused in the doorway. Nobody hugged me. Nobody cried. Nobody asked if I'd be okay. Dad stood in the driveway with a cup of coffee. Mom watched from the kitchen window. Ethan was inside playing video games. I waited, just for a second, for someone to say, we love you, or you can always come home. Instead, Dad glanced at his watch. You've still got the house key. I reached into my pocket, placed it in his hand. Our fingers touched for less than a second. He looked at the key, not at me. Good luck. That was it. No goodbye. No daughter. Just good luck. I climbed into the truck beside Mrs. Alvarez. As we pulled away, I looked back once. Only once. My parents had already gone back inside, as if I had never lived there at all. I didn't know it then, but the next 10 years would change me in ways they could never have imagined. And one ordinary Tuesday morning, a single unexpected phone call would begin bringing every decision they had ever made, crashing back toward them. If you'd asked 17-year-old me what success looked like, I wouldn't have said a big house. I wouldn't have said 6 figures. I wouldn't have said vacations or designer handbags or luxury cars. Success was much smaller than that. Success was opening a refrigerator and knowing the food inside belonged to me. Success was taking a shower without wondering if someone would remind me how much the water cost. Success was buying a bottle of shampoo because I needed it, not because I'd finally convinced myself I deserved it. That little apartment above the garage wasn't glamorous. The carpet was faded. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person. When it rained hard, I could hear every drop striking the metal roof above my bedroom. But every night I'd lock the door, lean against it, and smile. Nobody was going to tell me I owed them for existing. Nobody was going to slide a handwritten bill across a kitchen table. For the first time in my life, home felt quiet in the right way. Not the cold, empty quiet I'd grown up with. The peaceful kind. The kind where silence meant safety. The first year was brutal. I finished high school while working nearly full-time. There were mornings when I'd wake up before sunrise to shovel snow from the driveway because that was part of my agreement with Mrs. Alvarez's cousin. Then I'd race to school, then straight to work, then home to study until midnight. I learned that exhaustion has different flavors. There was physical exhaustion, that faded after sleep. Then there was emotional exhaustion, that settled into your bones. Some nights I'd sit on the floor eating boxed macaroni because it was all I could afford. I'd look around my tiny apartment and wonder if my parents ever thought about me. Did Mom wonder if I was eating? Did Dad ever ask where I worked? Did Ethan notice my room was empty? The answer always arrived before the questions finished. If they cared, they would have called. They never did. Not once. Not on my 18th birthday. Not at graduation. Not at Christmas. The silence hurt. Then it became familiar. Eventually, it became freedom. Community college came first. It was all I could afford. I took classes during the day, worked evenings, cleaned offices on weekends. I lived by spreadsheets before I even knew what a real budget looked like. Every dollar had a job. Rent, groceries, gas, emergency savings, textbooks. No impulse purchases, no vacations, no safety net. One mistake could ruin everything. There were moments when I almost gave up. One semester, my old Honda died in the grocery store parking lot. The repair estimate was more than I had in savings. I sat behind the steering wheel and cried. Not because of the car, because every setback reminded me how alone I was. Most people my age called their parents. "Can you loan me a few $100s? I'll pay you back." That sentence didn't exist in my world. I learned how to solve problems because nobody else would solve them for me. Years passed quietly. One promotion became another. I discovered I was surprisingly good with numbers. Budgeting had become second nature after years of surviving. My manager encouraged me to apply for an accounting assistant position, then another. Eventually, I finished my bachelor's degree one class at a time. Slowly, painfully, but I finished. The day I graduated, I held the diploma in both hands for nearly 10 minutes before opening the envelope. I cried, not because I'd earned a degree, because there was nobody waiting outside with flowers, no parents searching the crowd, no family dinner afterward. Mrs. Alvarez came. She clapped louder than anyone. When she hugged me, she whispered, "I knew you'd make it." Those 5 words healed something my parents had broken years earlier. By 27, life looked nothing like I'd imagined at 17. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. I worked as a senior financial analyst for a regional healthcare company. I'd saved carefully, invested carefully, planned carefully. I had a modest 3-bedroom house on a quiet street. Nothing extravagant, just mine. Every wall had been painted by my own hands. Every piece of furniture had been bought because I wanted it, not because it was the cheapest thing available. Sometimes I'd walk through the house late at night just appreciating small things, the dishwasher humming, the smell of fresh coffee waiting for morning, a shelf full of books, fresh fruit in the kitchen. Things people take for granted become extraordinary when you've lived without them. I hadn't spoken to my parents in almost 10 years, not because I'd blocked them, because they never reached out. The silence had become mutual. Occasionally, someone from my hometown would mention them online. Photos popped up from community events. Ethan's baseball career ended after high school. He bounced between jobs, still lived at home, still smiling in family photos. Dad's hair had turned gray. Mom looked older. Time had moved for everyone. I rarely thought about them anymore, or at least, that's what I told myself. The truth is, trauma doesn't disappear. It just stops introducing itself every morning. Then came Tuesday. It was raining. Again. Funny how the biggest moments in my life always seem to arrive with rain. I was halfway through making coffee before work when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored those. Something made me answer. Hello? Silence. Then, Chloe? My stomach tightened instantly. I'd know that voice anywhere. Mom. I hadn't heard it in nearly a decade. For a second, 17-year-old me came rushing back, the scared girl counting dollars at the kitchen table. Then I remembered where I was. My kitchen. My coffee. My life. Yes? Oh. She sounded relieved. I wasn't sure this was still your number. It is. Another silence, long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, she sighed. How have you been? I almost laughed. 10 years. That was her first question. I've been fine. Oh, that's good. More silence. She wasn't calling to catch up. I could hear it. People don't disappear for 10 years and suddenly become curious about your hobbies. So, I said, why are you calling? The pause this time lasted even longer. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Smaller somehow. We need help. Not, I miss you. Not, I'm sorry. We need help. She explained everything over the next 15 minutes. Dad had retired earlier than expected. A factory closure affected his pension. Medical bills piled up after a surgery. They'd refinanced the house, then refinanced again. Interest rates rose. Credit card debt followed. Eventually, the bank foreclosed. They had 3 weeks before they had to leave. I listened quietly. Every financial decision she described made perfect sense to me, professionally. Personally, I felt strangely detached. She continued. Ethan's apartment is very small. Apartment? Interesting. So he can't take both of you? Not comfortably. I understood. So, she inhaled deeply. We were wondering, there it was, if we could stay with you. I looked around my kitchen, at the family-sized table I'd bought because someday I hoped friends would gather around it. At the guest room I'd turned into a reading room. At the hallway, the stairs, the windows. Every inch of this place existed because a 17-year-old girl refused to quit. And now, the people who'd charged that girl rent wanted free housing. Life has an incredible sense of irony. I'll think about it. Mom sounded almost surprised. You will? I said I'll think about it. Thank you. I hung up, then stood perfectly still. Coffee forgotten. Rain tapping against the windows. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed calm. What surprised me wasn't anger. It was the absence of panic. 10 years earlier, I would have done anything for their approval. Now, I simply had choices. That evening, I opened a notebook. Not because I intended to say yes, because I wanted to understand why my answer felt so complicated. On one page, I wrote, reasons to help. They're my parents. People make mistakes. Maybe they've changed. On the opposite page, reasons not to. They charged a child rent. They threatened homelessness. They never apologized. They never called. They only remembered me when they needed something. The second list filled the page. The first one stayed almost empty. I stared at both for a long time. Then something occurred to me. They weren't asking because they'd rebuilt a relationship. They were asking because they'd run out of options. There was a difference. A very important difference. Over the next week, the phone calls increased. Dad left a voicemail. Short. Awkward. Your mother says you're thinking about it. No apology. No acknowledgement of the past. Just logistics. Then Ethan texted me. His first message in years. Hey, Mom and Dad are really stressed. I hope you'll help them out. I stared at the screen, then typed one sentence. Did you know they charged me rent at 16? 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Finally. Dad said you wanted independence. I closed my eyes. Even now. Even after all these years. That was the story they'd told him. Not that they demanded money. Not that they threatened to throw me out. I had simply wanted independence. Amazing. The lie had survived longer than the truth. I put my phone down. For the first time since Mom called, I wasn't thinking about housing. I was thinking about accountability. Because one thing became painfully clear. They didn't believe they'd done anything wrong. And if they moved into my house believing they were the victims, nothing would ever change. I wasn't interested in revenge that involved screaming, or insults, or slamming doors. I wanted something else, something they'd never been forced to experience. Consequences, real ones, the kind that don't raise their voice, the kind that simply hold up a mirror. And as I sat there, looking at the notebook still open on my kitchen table, an idea began to form. Slowly, quietly, so simple that I almost smiled. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't giving someone pain, it's making them live by the very rules they created. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was wrestling with forgiveness. That decision had already settled somewhere deep inside me. No. What kept me awake was a different question. What does justice actually look like? For years, I'd imagined this moment in vague, dramatic flashes. My parents begging, me slamming the door. A speech worthy of a movie. But real life rarely works that way. Real justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's sitting alone at 2 a.m. with a cup of tea that's gone cold, realizing you finally have something you never had before. Control. Nobody could force me into anything anymore. Not guilt, not obligation, not fear. When I finally crawled into bed, I made myself one promise. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to become the kind of person they had been. I wasn't going to humiliate them just because I could. I wanted them to understand, if understanding was still possible. The next morning, I called Mom. She answered before the second ring. Chloe, I've thought about it. Oh, thank goodness. You and Dad can come over Saturday. There was an audible sigh of relief. We can? Yes. We'll bring lunch. You don't need to. I insist. No. I kept my voice calm. We need to talk first. The silence stretched. Okay. And Ethan doesn't come. Another pause. Why? Because this conversation is between the three of us. She quietly agreed. Saturday arrived bright and cool. The kind of autumn morning where the air smells like dry leaves and distant fireplaces. I cleaned the house. Not because I expected guests, because cleaning helped me think. Every room reminded me how long this road had been. The hardwood floors I'd saved 2 years to install. The bookshelves I'd built myself after watching online tutorials. The framed diploma hanging in the hallway. My first paycheck from my corporate job sat in a small shadow box beside it. Not because it was financially significant, because it represented something no one could ever take away again. I heard tires crunch against the gravel driveway, then car doors. 2, not 3. Good. I opened the front door before they knocked. For a second, none of us spoke. Time had been unkind to them. Dad stood slightly hunched. His shoulders no longer filled a doorway. Mom's hair had turned almost completely silver. They looked smaller, older, more fragile. It would have been easy to mistake that for innocence. But age doesn't erase history. It only proves you've lived long enough to face it. Mom smiled nervously. You look, she searched for the word. Happy. I am. Dad nodded once. Nice house. Thank you. I stepped aside. Come in. They walked slowly through the entryway. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. Mom touched the staircase railing. Dad looked around the living room. There was admiration in his eyes. Maybe even surprise. I wondered if he remembered telling me reality would teach me a lesson. It had. Just not the one he'd expected. I offered coffee. Mom accepted. Dad asked for water. Small talk drifted awkwardly around the kitchen. Work. Weather. Traffic. As though 10 years hadn't happened. As though we were neighbors instead of strangers connected by blood. Eventually, I set my mug down. I think we should talk. Both of them straightened. Dad folded his hands exactly the way he used to at our old kitchen table. The gesture almost made me laugh. Some habits never leave. I know why you're here. Mom nodded. We've had some bad luck. I let that sentence sit for a moment. Bad luck? Dad answered. Medical bills? I understand. The economy? I understand. The foreclosure? I understand. I looked directly at him. I'm a financial analyst. His face changed slightly. He hadn't known that. I understand exactly how those things happen. Nobody spoke. Then I quietly asked, Do you know what I don't understand? Dad frowned. What? Why your 16-year-old daughter was paying rent. Silence. Complete silence. Mom looked down. Dad inhaled slowly. We've been over this. No. We were teaching responsibility. There it is. What? The same sentence. I leaned back. 10 years. You've had 10 years to think about what happened. He shifted uncomfortably. And that's still your answer? He rubbed his palms together. You turned out successful. I actually blinked. What? You became responsible. The room went still. I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, certainty. You think this proves you were right? I think. He hesitated. It obviously motivated you. I stared at him for several long seconds. Then I asked the simplest question I could think of. Would you do it to Ethan? His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Finally. That's different. I nodded slowly. I know. Mom whispered. Chloe. No. I held up a hand. I need to hear it. I looked at Dad. Tell me why it's different. He couldn't, because there wasn't an answer. Only favoritism. Only years of pretending there had been a reason, when there never was. I stood up. Come with me. They followed me down the hallway, past the office, past the guest room, until we reached the third bedroom. Dad looked confused. It's empty. It is. The room held a neatly made bed, a dresser, a reading chair beside the window. Clean, comfortable, warm. Mom smiled faintly. It's lovely. I nodded. It could be yours? Both of them looked at me. Hope appeared so quickly it almost hurt to watch. Dad actually smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. I knew you'd... I interrupted him. There would just be one condition. Anything. His answer came instantly. I walked to the desk, opened a folder, removed 3 printed sheets, placed them neatly on the bed. Dad looked down. His smile disappeared. At the top, in large bold letters, it read, Residential Occupancy Agreement. Mom frowned. What is this? A rental agreement. Neither of them moved. I continued calmly. The room is furnished. Utilities are included. Internet is included. You'll have access to the kitchen and laundry. Dad looked up. Rent? Yes. Mom's voice barely rose above a whisper. How much? I answered without hesitation. $350 per month. The exact amount they'd charged me. Every penny. Dad's face went pale. You're serious. I am. We can't afford that. I tilted my head slightly. I thought paying rent built character. His jaw tightened. This is different. I know. The words came easily now. You aren't me. Silence. Absolute silence. His own sentence. Returned after 10 years. I watched recognition spread slowly across his face. He remembered. Of course he remembered. The words he'd thrown at a frightened 16-year-old girl. Now they belonged to him. Mom sat down on the edge of the bed. Tears filled her eyes. Chloe, I've done the math. I kept my voice gentle. If you both receive Social Security and Dad's pension, you can afford it. It'll be tight. It was for me too. Dad looked away. I continued. You'll need to budget. You may have to skip eating out. No unnecessary purchases. If you're late, I paused deliberately. There's a $50 late fee. His eyes snapped toward me. I met them calmly. And after 30 days, nobody breathed. You'll need to figure it out. Mom covered her mouth. Dad lowered himself slowly into the reading chair. For the first time in my life, he looked defeated. Not because of the money, because he had finally heard his own words. Not through memory, through experience. Several minutes passed before anyone spoke. Finally. Mom whispered, I never stopped you. I looked at her. I know. I should have. Yes. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. I was afraid. So was I. She closed her eyes. I kept telling myself your father knew best. I smiled sadly. I used to believe that too. She cried quietly. No dramatic sobbing. Just the exhausted tears of someone looking backward instead of forward. Dad still hadn't spoken. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he asked, Were you really skipping lunch? I looked at him. You didn't know? He shook his head once. No. I thought... His voice cracked. I thought you were exaggerating. I wasn't. He stared at the floor. I didn't know. I believed him. Not because he was innocent, because neglect often comes from choosing not to see. He hadn't asked. He hadn't wanted to know. That was its own kind of guilt. After another long silence, Dad stood. He didn't look at the rental agreement. He looked at me. Really looked at me. Perhaps for the first time since I was a little girl. I owe you an apology. The words sounded unfamiliar, like he'd never spoken them before. You do. I'm sorry. He swallowed. For all of it. I waited. He continued. I thought I was making you stronger. You made me lonelier. His shoulders fell. I know that now. You didn't make me successful. I tapped my own chest. I did. He nodded. You're right. And if Mrs. Alvarez hadn't helped me, I let the sentence hang. He understood the ending without hearing it. I might not have survived it. Mom reached for my hand, tentatively, as though expecting me to pull away. This time, I didn't. Not because everything was forgiven, because I no longer needed distance to protect myself. I don't hate you, I said quietly. I just spent too many years believing I wasn't worth loving. She began crying again. I know. No. I shook my head. I don't think you do. I measured my value by whether I could afford to stay in my own bedroom. Neither of them answered. There wasn't anything left to say. Dad looked once more at the rental agreement, then back at me. You knew we wouldn't sign it. I did. So why? I smiled, because I needed you to feel the weight of the question. What question? What does it feel like? I looked around the room. When home starts sounding like a business transaction? Nobody answered. They didn't need to. They stayed another hour. We talked. Really talked. Not perfectly. Not easily. There were long silences, painful memories, questions without satisfying answers. Before they left, Dad stopped at the front door. I won't ask to move in. Okay. I don't think I deserve that. I appreciated the honesty. Then he reached into his wallet, pulled out a worn envelope. I've carried this for months. Inside was a cashier's check. $5,000. It isn't enough. No. It never will be. No. I know. He placed it on the entry table. I calculated what you paid us. My chest tightened. I added interest. I stared at him. I know money doesn't fix this. It doesn't. But maybe. He looked around my home. It's where I should have started. I accepted the envelope, not because it erased the past, because this time, he offered it freely. No conditions, no lecture, no claim that he was teaching responsibility, just accountability. Over the next year, our relationship remained careful, slow, sometimes uncomfortable. They rented a small apartment nearby, not mine, their own. Dad took part-time work despite retirement. Mom volunteered at a community food pantry. Once a month, we'd meet for coffee. Some conversations were easy, others reopened old wounds. Healing isn't a straight line, it's a staircase. Some steps feel like progress, others make you wonder if you've moved at all. People sometimes ask whether I forgave them. The truth is, forgiveness isn't a single decision. It's hundreds of small ones. Some days it feels effortless. Other days I remember counting coins for shampoo at 16, or skipping lunch, or handing over my paycheck. And forgiveness becomes heavier. But revenge? That part was surprisingly simple. I didn't destroy their lives. I didn't embarrass them publicly. I didn't make them homeless. I simply handed them the same lesson they'd insisted was fair. And for the first time, they understood exactly what it cost. If there's one thing I learned from everything that happened, it's this. Children don't owe their parents repayment for being raised. Providing food, shelter, and safety isn't a favor. It's the responsibility that comes with becoming a parent. What children remember isn't how expensive they were. They remember how loved they felt, or how unloved. For years, I believed I'd survived because I was stronger than everyone else. That wasn't true. I survived because, at the exact moment I needed one kind person chose compassion over judgment. Mrs. Alvarez changed my life with something that cost her nothing. She believed me. Sometimes that's where healing begins. And if my parents truly learned anything from all of this, it wasn't because I made them suffer. It was because, for one brief moment, I made them stand exactly where they had forced me to stand all those years ago. Sometimes that's the only mirror powerful enough to change a person. If this story made you wonder what you would have done in my place, let me know in the comments. Would you have let them move in? Or would you have closed the door for good? And if you enjoy stories where patience, resilience, and accountability win in the end, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. There are plenty more unforgettable revenge stories waiting for you in the next one.